Hey, this is Jackie with Jackie's Wreaths and Things. Today I want to show you how to do a 21-inch poof. So people have a lot of difficulty with poofs, so I'm going to show you how I do a poof that ends up making a full, beautiful wreath. Now what I'm using is I'm going to use 21-inch jute mesh. This is Craig Bachman. I got it from Craft Outlet. And just in case you're wondering, how do I know if it's Craig Bachman? Well, if it's poly jute mesh, this is the label that you will see. No matter where you purchase it, if it's Craig Bachman, this will be the label that you see. So let's get started. One of the first things that I do before I start on my wreath base is I'm going to go ahead and pull my ties out. This will make it so that I'll handle my mesh less and make it easier to put into the tie. Now I'll leave the ones on the inner ring facing in. The other thing that's very important when you're doing a poof is how you let your mesh roll off your roll. It's very important that you let it roll this way off your roll. What I do to keep my mesh from going all over the floor is I have a Tupperware bucket that is the size of my mesh rolls, and it's on the floor, and that'll keep my mesh from twisting and turning while I'm working with it. So what you want to do to start your wreath, you want to gather your mesh up. I'm gathering it up in as straight as line as possible. Then you want to open your tie and tie it down as securely as possible, as tight as you can. Now, if you don't have good hand strength, you could add a zip tie to secure that. When you make a poof, you make sure that the outer edge of your mesh is on the outside. So as you gather your mesh up, and I do that really gently, I don't do it tight, I make sure that my outer edge is here in my hand and the other one is here facing out. I don't let them roll under. Now I'm going to make a 12-inch poof. That's my style preference. Once I get done, you'll see why. So I literally, on my cutting mat, measure 12 inches. Then I'm going to take my poof. Here's my guideline for my 12 inches in my hand. I'm going to go on to my next tie. And I'm going to take my fingers to help me hold that down in the tie. Because once again, we want to tie that as securely as possible. Now do you see how I have a really nice rounded poof? So we're going to continue on to do that. Once again, I'm going to make sure with each poof that I do that the outer edge is on the outside and that the other edge is on the outside as I gather it in my hand. I am gently taking, I'm not doing this tightly, I'm just gently taking my hand down my mesh and measuring the 12 inches. Now the reason that I like a 12-inch poof is because it fills the wreath out beautifully. Now you can use a 10-inch poof if you prefer. If you do use a 10-inch poof, you will get usually you'll be able to get 2 wreaths out of 1 roll of 21-inch mesh. So we're going to continue down. The key to it is making these as tight as possible. You don't want to do that loose. And then I always like to stand my ties up so they'll be out of the way later on. Every time that I gather my mesh up, I am making sure that the outer edges are on the outside and they do not roll up and under the mesh, because this will make my poof smaller and flatten it out. And what I do to ensure that, when I grab my mesh, I take it and I twist it up. And then as I'm gathering, there's my other edge again. And then I measure the 12 inches. So we're just about done with the top of the wreath, and I always start on the top. If you start on the bottom and then you cross back up, you're snagging your mesh that's on the bottom and dragging it along, and it just makes it very difficult to lay your base. So now that we're done with the top of our base, we're going to go down to the bottom. Now this is just as important how you get to the bottom. What I'm going to do is I'm going to gather my mesh up once again. I'm going to go to the closest tie, which is the one actually directly below it. But I'm going to kind of push my mesh forward to keep my ties from rolling back. And then I'm just going to cross down to the bottom, cram my mesh in there, and tie it securely. And then I'm going to continue on making my poofs. Now, as I go around the bottom, I'm not going to fix my poofs as I go. I will come back and fix them when I'm done. The technique does not change as you go from the top to the bottom. You're still going to continue to make sure that your edges of your mesh are on the outside and that they are not rolled up. The work frame that I'm using for this is a standard 15-inch work form. I purchased mine from Craft Outlet. I have found that the ones from Craft Outlet don't let the mesh roll under the wreath form as much as some of the other ones do. I'm still measuring 12 inches for my poofs around the bottom. And I'm tying my ties about 2 times just to make sure that the mesh is securely in the tie. I prefer the pencil form. That's what this is called. When it has the tinsel ties like this, it's called a pencil form. Some of them call them tinsel forms, but pretty much it's called a pencil form. I prefer these because the ties are longer and easier to work with. If I need to cut them off later on, they won't show up as much in my wreath. Now if I want one that shows up in my wreath, I'll get the standard work form, which the standard work form has the larger, thicker ties on them. Typically, the only time I use those is if it's evergreen and it'll add something to my wreath. Now this standard work form has 8 ties on top and 10 on the bottom. And they are spaced approximately 5 inches apart. Now that we have our mesh all the way around, I'm going to make sure that that's tied in there very secure. Once again, if you don't have the hand strength to make sure that this is tied in here really secure on the bottom, you can finish off securing this with a zip tie. But for me, I'm just going to go ahead and cut this off. And I'm going to continue now. I'm going to fix my poofs on the bottom. So on the bottom, when I fix my poofs and I fluff them out, I'm going to go in between the ties. I'm going to take my mesh, the edge of my mesh, and I'm going to pull it up in between the top ties. And I'm really going to fluff them out. I'm going to separate my poof here on the top. And once again, I'm going up between the tie. Now sometimes you'll have 2 of your poofs that end up between the ties, which is fine. And here's an example of where that's going to happen. Now pulling your poof up between your ties is also later on, it's going to prevent your mesh from rolling underneath your wreath. We don't want that. And there you have it. There's your beautifully poofed mesh wreath. The recommended ribbon that I would cut length would be 14 inches for a 12-inch poof. And you can go back to 12 inches if you choose to use a 10-inch poof. Now a 10-inch poof will not fill out like the 12-inch poof. You'll have little gaps. But this is why I prefer a 12-inch poof, because of how well it fills the wreath out. Thank y'all so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial.